very co-constructed in that way. The only thing I ask is when you do, add something or ask a question, just introduce yourself, because I see a lot of familiar faces, but also a lot of new faces, and I think the more we can all get to know one another, the better. And so I appreciate you all taking your time out of your day, especially this time of the semester, busy time. So I will try to make this as fruitful as possible. I printed out 20 printouts of the slides, so if you'd like one, maybe share with a neighbor. And these, I believe, can be also available through WISCAPE if you want the electronic version of the slides. So, without further ado, right? Education Deserts and the Geography of College Opportunity. This is the only third time I've shared this project, and each time I've shared it, well, except for with my wife. Thanks for coming. Thursdays are usually our lunch days, so this is our lunch date. But I've shared it once with the Civil Rights Project. Gary Orfield's shop commissioned a few papers a couple months ago to discuss some of the unintended consequences or potential unintended consequences of the federal rating system. And for those of you familiar with it, we can talk about that more. It's not really the center of today's talk, however, but that's sort of the impetus. That was the first time I shared this project, was through that opportunity. It was a wonderful opportunity. On Capitol Hill, we went up to DC and shared this with think tanks and folks in town and staffers on how to think about place and think about geography when thinking about improving college choices, because you'll see that's not been really part of the conversation, at least not a central part of the conversation. And so then the following day, I was invited to give a similar talk, sort of expanded talk, at the American Council on Education, ACE, also in Washington. So they have these monthly meetings where they get research analysts from all the think tanks around town, all the membership groups, and they just talk shop about research projects, kind of update each other on what's going on, basically. And so I shared it with them. And in both of those settings, I got such insightful and helpful feedback, but also a lot of hurrahs, like, yes, do this, keep going, keep plowing the field. And so I think this is, the third try is a charm, right? I think here it's great to be able to share this with colleagues here in town and to follow up on anything from today's conversation. I'd love to keep this going. So that's the backstory. So the quick overview here, hopefully you can see that okay. I've got 20 slides, and so I think hopefully I can get through this in 20, maybe 30 minutes. But like I said, stop me anytime. Start off with kind of some of the motivation. I've already kind of given a little bit of it. Talk about the policy and the research context in a little bit more detail. And I'm an assistant professor in the Educational Leadership and Policy Analysis Department. This is right up my alley. I study higher education and finance. And you'll see at the end where I'm tying this into finance. It might not be immediately clear, but there is a connection. And then I want to discuss the data. That's actually a really fun part of this. I really want to discuss data with you all and find ways we might be able to share databases, data sources, and collaborate in those ways. And then hit the high notes on the key findings and then kind of reflect on some of the next steps and some of the implications on what do you do now, right? So, sound like a good game plan? All right. So this idea, it grew out of a couple of different places. The main one is a personal one to me. I'm from Elkhart, Indiana, northern Indiana, and during the recession, my whole family was all unemployed, laid off, didn't have a place to work, was continuing to get unemployment insurance extensions and trying to find ways to just get by. And this is the case for 1 in every 4 people up in Elkhart, Indiana. Same with here, your families, our families are affected, we're affected by this, are continuing to be affected by unemployment problems. And so the human capital theory, would say, well, this is, you've got all this extra time on your hand, you should go back to school, which is not the case at all. And so not only did my family not go back to school, people that are in our family network didn't go back to school, primarily because there wasn't a school around. And it was like hiding in plain sight. I was like, oh my gosh, there's 250,000 people who live in this area, and the only school they have is Ivy Tech Community College if they wanted to go back and retrain. Or they might go to IU South Bend, Indiana University in South Bend, good 30, 45-minute drive that's going to cost money and time. And so this started really speaking to me because of my interest in college access. I thought, why is this not a topic that is more obvious in the research? And so that sort of ties in with the academic side of my interests here on this sort of policy rhetoric about college choice, how we talk about how students choose college, why they go where they go, and the processes that are involved in the choice making of your educational destination. And well, what I'm arguing here is that we focus so much attention on the process of opportunity. Did you fill out your FAFSA? Did you, apply to the right schools? Or, did you do this sort of search process that you're expected to do? Versus the geography of opportunity. So there's a process of opportunity, but I'm more interested in the geography of opportunity. And so those two things don't always intersect. And from the geography of opportunity side of the house, it's obvious that a community is a built environment. You've got your public schools, you've got your parks, you've got your transportation systems, or lack of those things, right? That shapes the way that you interact with your community. And colleges, and especially community colleges and open access 4-year public colleges, are part of that built environment. But we don't really talk about it in that way, at least not in the college choice literature. And so to understand college choices, we have to understand the environment in which choices are made. Just like for those of you familiar with food deserts, we have high concentrations of communities that have chronic health problems and high rates of diabetes and a number of health issues, and we wonder why that's the case. Well, it's often because nutritional and affordable food isn't available where people live. And so instead of changing the system, a lot of the interventions try to change people's behaviors. And so you see this kind of disconnect of how do we think about choices in relation to the environment where those choices are made. So y'all with me? All right. So no matter how well informed a consumer is, whether it's with buying food or choosing a hospital or choosing any sort of other service, no matter how well informed a consumer is, choices are constrained by what's nearby. No different in higher education. At least this is my assumption, right? So the main questions here, there are two, and they're really basic questions, kind of obvious questions in some ways that I'm surprised that we haven't really dug into in the research, at least not as much as I think we ought to. So the first one is just, to what extent do the number of colleges vary according to a community's socioeconomic, labor market, and racial and ethnic profiles? A pretty simple question. How many colleges are there and where are they? We don't really talk about that in higher ed. And then the follow-up is sort of playing around this idea of the food desert, education desert, right? Just thinking about where are those communities that have the fewest public options. So similar to how we think of a food desert of a place where you have unaffordable or poor nutritional value access to food, we can think of that in a lot of ways in the public sector or in higher education as well. Is the college that's nearby affordable, accessible? Is it even one that has a good track record of serving students well? We can think about it in a very similar way and learn some lessons, I think, from the food desert's work. So we're going to have some maps. We're going to have some fun maps. But this is sort of a teaser. We're going to talk about commuting zones, and they're just clusters of counties. And so we've got 3,100 some counties across the U.S. that cluster into about 700 or so commuting zones. So when I talk about community, when I talk about local, I'm talking about commuting zones. I'll talk about that more in a minute, but yes, this is going to be a map thing.
Yeah, and you're focusing on the number of colleges. There's a number of parasitical institutions that aren't very well staffed, that perhaps don't provide benefits for people. We have some here in Madison at the edges of our city here. Yeah. And I'm just wondering, are you going to be dealing with that notion of the parasitical institution?
Parasitical.
Yeah,
could you introduce yourself, please, also?
Joanne Orevic, University of Wisconsin Whitewater. We're not a parasitical institution.
That's right. Good disclaimer. This study, what I'm working on now, is only focusing on public sector and nonprofit institutions. I'm not looking at for-profit colleges, which maybe is where you're leaning. Okay. However, I have done some of that analysis, and I can talk about that. Yeah. So, and also these are just on public Tableau, so I've got links if you want to play around with these maps. I've layered a bunch of data on top of it if you just want to go explore. So a little bit more context. So, so we've got here, you know, one of my assumptions was, well, maybe I've got this all wrong. Maybe nobody's researching this stuff because place really doesn't matter. And there's a study, a big study in the late 90s. Carolyn Hawksby, an economist at Harvard, says, or Princeton, I forget where she is. She says, you know, place doesn't really matter because technology and transportation costs have just fundamentally flattened the marketplace, and we don't need to worry about place. And that argument, I think, has sort of been accepted. And so what this does here is just breaks out 4 different sectors. We've got our public community colleges, our public four-year colleges, our nonprofit four-year schools. Didn't include for-profits. And then the total. And anybody who enrolled exclusively online are out of the picture here. So this is a nationally representative sample from 2012. And this struck me. I was surprised we don't talk about this enough in higher ed. On average, this is the lighter color here is the average. On average, students attending community colleges go about 31 miles between their home and their college. But you know how averages work, you can get skewed pretty quickly. So if you take the median, probably a better measure here, only 8 miles. People stay close to home, especially for community colleges. Here I thought there would be a lot more noise. And on median, only 18 miles. Only about 20 miles. And granted, this is going to vary from state to state, obviously. But the point being, you know, the Hawksby argument that there's a sort of, you know, place doesn't matter is not really jiving with the evidence. And so it might matter here. Surprise, surprise. The private nonprofits, sure. And if we talk about college choice as being unrelated to distance, you're probably talking about these schools. Yeah.
So for this public four-year,
Yep.
is it people who are at the college and they report where they're living at the college?
No, their hometown. Can you introduce yourself, please?
Hi, I'm Edward. I'm in the Department of OBGYN.
No, this is their home, like their home where they originally were before going to the school. Or if they are enrolled and living at home, it would capture that as well. So like people who live on campus, for example, wouldn't be reporting how close they are. Yeah. Good question. So another part of this, and this gets kind of to your question a little bit, I started looking at, all right, before I really get into this distance stuff and place stuff, how many students even enroll online? Because that's part of the argument. Well, you know, place doesn't matter because they can access online courses. Well, the Department of Education does, God bless them, right? They try as best they do. They have not really reported well on distance education until just recently. And they started to get some surveys out, and they're saying about, their estimates are about 8 and 10% of students in those two sectors enroll exclusively in distance learning. For the most part, distance learning is going to be happening in the for-profit sector. But I thought, man, if publics, you know, have like 30% of their students enrolling online, then it's going to really, you know, throw a wrench in my study here. But it's not the case. I don't think this is a big issue. It is an issue, but it's not one that's going to totally derail looking at geography. You guys buy that? Yeah? Okay. So let's just give some more context here. Most students attend non-selective schools. Here, another thing that we don't really focus on. We're like, we like to pretend that every student's going to go to Harvard or going to go to the fancy schools, right? No, most students go, this is a national snapshot of all of the total enrollments in the course of a year, head counts, by the college's selectivity. The college they were admitted to, how selective is that school, how many people then enroll in those schools. So this is a total, if you add all this up, it's like 22 million students or so. The biggest chunk of this pie are students who attend schools that enroll 90% of or higher of their applicants. These are broad access institutions. These are schools that are community colleges for the most part, or that have a mission of serving their regional and local needs. Sort of what Jason, the WISCAPE discussion from a few weeks ago about comprehensive colleges. These are your guys. These are the workhorses of higher ed. But we oftentimes focus on that smallest chunk of the pie, those most selective schools that admit half of their students or half of their applicants or fewer, and that's like less than 10% of the total enrollment. So we focus here, and we need to be focusing here and here in the more broad access institutions. So those other two circles are just 50 to 75% admissions and 75 to 90% admissions. So that's one big thing. The other part that kind of gets lost in translation and is again hiding in plain sight is that public colleges, not only the most affordable, but they're most accessible. 3/4 of all students, undergraduates, enroll in public institutions. So again, we focus oftentimes on college choice, and we get distracted by the nonprofit elite sort of selective schools as being the issue, when we got to bring, I think, place back into it, and public places especially. So there is literature on the geography of college opportunity. It's not that robust, but there's some excellent, excellent studies, and I'd love to share those with you all if you're interested in any of this stuff. And it goes back for, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Just to orient myself to that.
Yeah.
What is, so UW-Madison, what is the acceptance rate?
Oh, I don't know. Does anybody know offhand? Yeah, Ashley.
About 50%, although last year's numbers are a little bit lower, depends on if they're in-state or out. In-state's about 50%, out-of-state is a little bit less.
Could you two also please introduce yourselves?
I'm Karen, direct geography.
Okay, oh good, thanks.
I'm actually that's what I was doing, senior high and
Got
and I
it.
used to work in admissions.
Oh, okay.
There we go, good. See, this is good. This is why we all get together.
That a little bit, about
Yep.
43% of those accepted end up coming. And Al Barnacle, Alba.
Excellent, thanks Al. This is good. So the geography opportunity literature, it falls into what I think are three main bins. You have some studies that talk about distance elasticity, kind of how we talk about tuition or affordability elasticity. For every dollar increase, your chances of enrolling drop, you know. They use it as every mile increase you are from the school, chances of enrolling drop. And so they find pretty much a U-shaped pattern here, where for the most part, students who apply to a school have a really good chance of applying if the school is nearby, and then the further away the school is, then the chances start to drop. But at a certain point, it starts to uptick again. So they might be so remote that they need to apply everywhere, or there might just be some places, like that sector, right, that are just so desirable that people are willing to apply there no matter what. So that's the U-shape. The chances drop as you get further away, but then at some point they start to increase the further away you are. Spillover effects. This is really interesting. Not a lot of research on this, but basically it's like a if you build it, they will come philosophy. That communities that have more public four-year colleges are the same communities where students are more likely to apply to public four-year colleges. Now, there's some endogeneity issues here, I'm certain, but the point is that if you don't have access to places, you're not going to apply anyways. And so spillover effects matter. The type of institution locally does affect how you make your choices. And then community ties is super important, where we talk about, a lot of times people talk about undermatching. You're familiar with that concept about students who could have applied and been accepted to a really fancy school, but they don't apply because they think it's out of reach or whatever. There are good reasons why people don't apply to schools. A lot of times it is because of these community ties, familial ties, other things that relate to their responsibilities and preferences and priorities about staying in your community. And a lot of times you see differences here on ethnic and racial lines where, for the most part, the evidence is showing how Hispanic families and certain Asian families tend to stay closer to home and want to have closer community ties than other families. So that's what the research has said for the most part. So I'm trying to incorporate that into my work too. Any questions on the context? I'm going to get into the details on the data, so that's a fun part too. Yeah.
Kevin Riley, former president of the system. I think you said when you were talking about students here, you were talking about commuter students, not residential students. Are you able to sort that clearly?
Oh boy. So I'll back up. So
because in part you're talking about students who are not anywhere yet and are thinking of applying
Yeah.
and how they behave.
Yeah.
You probably don't know whether those students necessarily are intending to be resident or commuter students.
Right. So these are only students who are in college. And I think what Edward is getting at is, are these people commuters or residential? And yes, you could disentangle that here. But what I'm getting at is different. Good clarification.
Right.
Yeah.
When you're talking about how students who are not in college make their choices,
Yeah.
you don't know which kind of student you're talking about at that point.
No, because they're not students yet. Yeah. And that's one of the challenges. Yeah, absolutely.
To sort of follow up on that, Adam Kinchy, UW Foundation, can you break it down by age of the respondents?
Yeah.
Because that
Yep.
would help us get a little bit closer to it.
Yeah, I agree. Yep. Excellent. I'm just keeping a couple notes here. Okay, so excellent. And stop me anytime. So data sources. So here's the fun part. So this started off, like I said, very exploratory, and it still is in many ways. But what I'm doing here is I'm taking institutional data. So Kevin, you're asking about sort of students, sort of individuals as the unit of analysis. We'll see here that institutions are the unit of analysis, and eventually the commuting zone is going to be the unit of analysis. So we've got a lot of aggregation bias that we just, we can't get the kind of detail that we really want, but it's something. So starting off with colleges, institution level data, you go to the U.S. Department of Education, their IPEDS data system, it lists things like what sector the college is in, how selective the school is, their enrollments by race, gender, the finances of the school, how much federal Pell Grant dollars are coming through the school, how tuition reliant is the school, all sorts of things. And I'm selecting only those schools that offer degrees and that are accredited. So maybe getting to your point a little bit here. And there's almost 5,000 of these institutions. They have to receive Title IV funds or be eligible to receive Title IV federal student financial aid funds to be in this sample. So these are the schools that, it runs the gamut. It's got public, private, nonprofit in here all together. Oh, can you see those? Well, if you really squint, maybe there are 7 counties there. Can you even see those? There are 7 counties there. So the next part of this analysis, after getting that institution level data, saving that off to a file, then I go through and I get county level data. So those 7 counties represent the 7 counties of the Madison commuting zone. And we'll see that in just a second, what those are. But for each county, I can go in and just pull the race, ethnicity, population, the median household income for that county, the educational attainment levels for that county, poverty rates, industrial code, so like how many people are working in manufacturing, for example, the unemployment rate, and several other things, but these are the ones I've used in the analysis. And so you plug each of those into each individual county, and again, like I said, there's about 3,100 counties. And oh, there's a college in this county. So now I know that that commuting zone has a college in it. And this is starting to get into the deserts part. Like, okay, how can we identify the places that don't have colleges or don't have accessible colleges? Those 7 counties then, there they are, clustered together into a commuting zone. And there are 708 commuting zones. I'm using 11 years of data, 2002 through 2012. So I did these processes, 10, 11 different times, and I get a panel data set of 7,780 observations. I'm going to run some regressions on this stuff, and that's what I'm doing. But I think that the story is really, more well told at just a descriptive level, just sort of painting a picture, not really going over the top with regression models. But of course I do. So, keep that in mind, though. I think there's a really compelling story just on the descriptives here. But you'll all see that, you get the county level, they cluster into commuting zones, and then if a commuting zone has a college, then we can understand like how many colleges are there, or how selective are the colleges that are in the commuting zone. There are going to be some commuting zones that don't have colleges whatsoever. And so I want to know, what are the characteristics of those commuting zones? A commuting zone is not something I created. This is the Office of Management and Budget. They've been creating these things for the past couple of decades. Folks who are familiar with Raj Chetty, some of his work on social mobility, he's been using commuting zones, trying to see which communities around the country have the most and least upward mobility. David Autor is doing some work on minimum wages using commuting zones as the unit of analysis. I really think this is a promising way to go with further research on just kind of freshening up some of the higher education literature. We tend to just focus on either colleges or students, who would be over here, right? And I think we could also be doing a lot more cool things with commuting zones as our unit of analysis. So there we go again, back to the map. We've got 3,100 counties across the country. And just to kind of illustrate this a little bit further, let's focus in on Wisconsin. Like I said, this is up on Tableau, so if you do want to poke around, please, I would love it if you did. So Wisconsin has 19 commuting zones. I don't know if those colors show up very well, but these 7 counties from the previous slide, here's Dane County, one of those, right? And then our commuting zone incorporates Adams, Columbia, Dane, Iowa, Juneau, Marquette, and Sauk. Do you guys think that, I don't know, sounds good enough for a commuting zone? So the way these are defined are by using journey to work data. So the census is able to take information about where people who are working, where they live, where their home address is, and then they match it with wage records for where they get their paycheck from. And so they can tell where you go between home and work. And they create these clustered commuting zones statistically. So these are not just sort of arbitrary or like legally defined or anything like that. These are empirically defined. Doesn't mean they're perfect by any stretch, but it's something. And so using this journey to work data, those 7 counties cluster together, and across the whole country, counties cluster together. And so I use those, these are still broken out by counties, but they're clustering into 708 commuting zones. And so this is just the total number of colleges across the country by commuting zone. And so the white area here, like right here, you know, these little areas have no colleges whatsoever. Maybe there's nobody who lives there. Maybe that's why. But there are no colleges. And then as it gets darker, there are more colleges. And I just say 5 or more. There are some commuting zones that have, you know, dozens, hundreds of colleges, because commuting zones are not defined by population. They're defined by labor market sort of flow. And so they also incorporate rural areas. Metropolitan statistical areas we oftentimes think of when we think about communities or micropolitan areas. Those don't include rural communities. And so we really want to be sure to capture rural here. So, okay, so we've got colleges all across the country. And this is amazing. You think about how many colleges there are. And you think about other countries. There are no other countries that have this kind of abundance of colleges. Now, back to the, you know, whether these are parasitic colleges, good, I think you're onto something. It's a huge important point to keep in mind. But they are colleges. Now, let's sort of focus a little bit more narrowly on public colleges. Colleges that are designed to serve communities, local communities, designed to be, to some extent, open access and agents of the state, right? And so now we've gone from, this was total colleges, now we keep the same color code, and now we see, oh, wait a minute, there's a lot fewer, right? A lot fewer public colleges. We've got, I don't know, 1,000 or so public community colleges, 600 or so public four-year colleges across the country. And we can come back to these later, these maps later, and just have a discussion about what you see here. It's kind of like a Rorschach test in a way, you know? So now let's get a little bit narrower and look at only community colleges. So we see, like in Wisconsin, of course, we've got a lot of community tech colleges in Wisconsin, and that's why we're darker than some other states. Say, for example, look down here in South or West Texas, not a whole lot. There are pockets of the country that just don't have a robust community college system. I've got a student now digging into some state statutes to see if any states say, yes, you have to have, you know, community colleges within a certain proximity of your cities, that kind of stuff, because some states do. Or at least through their state master plans do. So now let's back up again. So we've gone from all colleges down to like total public colleges. Now we're getting even narrower to just the community colleges. And now we're going to get into the open access four-year schools. So these are your four-year colleges, public ones, that admit 90 to 100% of their students. So these are kind of like a community college in a way, that are broad access institutions that, you know, if you're unemployed, you're not going to have to, go through the application process, or at least a competitive application process. They're more flexible and responsive to local labor markets, at least in principle. And your regional comprehensive schools are many of these. And so we see, again, it's starting to sort of dry up. This abundance of colleges, right, starts to dry up when we talk about public colleges and public sectors. And now in the four-year sector, so if you actually want to go and get a BA, there aren't a lot of places, right? Really, there aren't a lot of places if you're place-bound. There are pockets. There certainly are pockets. And we can come back to these. But let me just do this last map here. So this is kind of the inverse, I suppose, of this previous map. The black counties here represent counties that either have a community college as their only college in the commuting zone, or an open access four-year college is the only one in their commuting zone. So they've only got one public option, or they have none at all. And we can, again, come back to this. Another Rorschach test. You all are probably looking at certain areas, your hometowns, seeing like, oh, am I from a desert? And maybe so. And the definition of the desert, I think, is still pretty fluid. So I'm using just, hey, if there's no public options or no accessible public options for desert. We can come back to this, and we will. So a couple of the findings, like I said, that I think is a powerful enough story and enough to write several articles on, right? But also enough to get us thinking about choice in different ways. But let's run a regression for fun of it, right? So we put in here all of those characteristics of those communities. That first research question, right? What are the characteristics of the communities relative to the number of colleges in them? You might not be able to see it, but this is just taking the race and ethnic profile of the communities. And what's most striking here, before I talk about those results, it's organized like this. The first column is just the number of public community colleges in your commuting zone. And then you go into the four-year sector, the number of public four-year sectors in your commuting zone. And it goes from your most selective, your less than 50%, so your Madison, right? Do we say Madison is less than 50? And then it goes up to your 50 to 75% admissions, and it goes to like 75 to 90% admissions, and then it goes to 90 or higher. These are your sort of most open access schools, and then just the total number of schools. To see if maybe, do these patterns hold up? You know, do these patterns that we're seeing over here, is there anything systematic going on here? Because ideally, if you want to talk about equality of opportunity, there'd be nothing, no patterns, right? There'd be nothing to see here, of course. So the thing that I'm most interested in here are Hispanic communities. And so as the number of people who live in a commuting zone who classify as Hispanic, or are classified as Hispanic from the Census Bureau, that's where this data is coming from, the significant findings here are that there are fewer and fewer and fewer and fewer public four-year colleges nearby. This is not a pattern that you see with other groups, and so this is sort of just visualizing this out. If we were to take the number of public two-year colleges and the number of Hispanics in a commuting zone, we can use these to estimate the number of colleges in that commuting zone. And so you see, okay, as Hispanic population is low, they might have one community college nearby. That makes sense. I mean, you don't have a lot of people, right? So you might not need a lot of colleges. However, as you get a lot more Hispanics in your commuting zone, it's barely budging. Your number of community colleges is rising, but it's barely rising. If we look then at the public four-year colleges, if you're a commuting zone that has very few Hispanics in it, you can have a lot of public four-year schools. But as Hispanics rise, not so much, right? You don't have as many options. And in public four-year open access schools, again, negative. So as Hispanic populations rise, there are fewer public options. And this is taken data from 2002 through 2012, right? So I'm kind of accounting for time in here because after the recession, there's a lot of mobility, not just with Hispanics, but also African Americans moving back to the South, people moving back to the big cities or away from big cities. And so even over time, these are sort of the general patterns we're seeing. And like I said earlier, this is a pretty blunt measure of community. You know, it's like a cluster of counties. Just imagine what we find if we go in even more fine-grained and go into one of these commuting zones and look at how things are structured. I mean, this is just big picture, and we see these trends. Another one that's interesting from these results is that the educational attainment of a commuting zone. So you have some communities, imagine your favorite one, right, that has a low percentage of people who have a BA, right? They would be a low educational attainment community. I'm imagining places in Kentucky, right? Places in Appalachia. Low BA attainment levels, and let's see how many colleges they have nearby. Do they even have places to go to college if they wanted to increase their educational attainment levels? No. And so as if you have a low educational attainment commuting zone, you're likely to have a whole bunch of community colleges that don't even offer bachelor's degrees. You're likely to not have very many four-year colleges in your commuting zone in the first place. And as that commuting zone becomes more educationally attained, right, increases their educational attainment levels, there are actually more public four-year colleges nearby. So that maybe isn't the most intuitive way to interpret these results, but it gets to that spillover effects, right, about, well, these communities have low educational attainment levels, partly because they don't have any colleges nearby to increase their educational attainment levels. So how do we build capacity of these communities in ways to actually change the kind of outcomes that we want to see or that we claim that we want to see? And so just kind of hitting the high notes again on the general findings. The marketplace, the higher education marketplace is fundamentally unequal. It's structurally unequal. And that is oftentimes ignored when we talk about college choices. So you're making choices in a broken market. Hispanic communities have fewer open access for your options. Black communities have more public options, but they're very selective public options. So are they very inclusive? We need to look into that. Native American Indian communities, they have a lot more open access colleges. Partly, I think, probably because of federal designations being tribal colleges. Asian communities have more public alternatives altogether, probably because they live in larger cities, or tend to live in larger cities. White communities have more nonprofit options, and a whole lot more nonprofit options. So I don't quite have a clear enough pathway of where to go with this, because I think you can go in a lot of different directions, but the main thing here is that when we look at those communities that have the absolute fewest alternatives, right? The education deserts. It tends to be your Hispanic communities, your rural and your working class communities. Probably not a big shocker to us, right? But it is so surprising that this is not a centerpiece of our college choice discussions. It's not a centerpiece of how we think about reforming these inequalities. We try to reform inequalities based on providing consumers better information, right? When we might want to be thinking about how to build up the unequal or to break down the inequalities that exist in our systems. And so a quick implication of findings. Am I doing okay on time? Guys, y'all good? A quick implication of the findings. So I talked about the rating system earlier. Just show of hand, how many of you are familiar-ish with the federal rating system or federal proposed rating system? Okay, we can discuss that more. It looks like maybe half or so. Some of the context here is that the feds want to provide more information about the quality of schools or about like different performance indicators of schools so that students can use that information to make better choices. And President Obama says this, make better choices about where to go to school. And it might be true for students who are able to shop around. But let's look at Uvalde, Eagle Pass, Southwest Texas here. And Edward and I were talking about this over text just the other night about communities that are by design unequal. And this is I think where this topic really needs to go. In Uvalde, Eagle Pass, 100,000 people in this community, primarily Hispanic, low levels of educational attainment, sort of the epitome of what I'm finding in the results here, right? And if they were to do what our federal bureaucrats think that students do when they choose colleges, they would go to this website, the College Navigator. It's part of the Higher Education Act where we're like, feds are like, we've got to get more information in the hands of consumers. So a student would enter in their zip code if they live there, and they would say, I want to find a college that's nearby. And let's just stretch this out. This is 100 miles. Any college nearby. And Joanne, this is coming back to you, I think. So they do that. They plug this in. They're going to find one public college. It's a junior college. It's a pretty decent junior college from what I understand. But then the other three options are all for-profits. And these for-profits are basically, I think their only programs are like, I don't know, we'll see in a second, I think it shows, cosmetology. So if you're a student, you live in Uvalde, Eagle Pass, your only public option is that two-year school. Its biggest major is general studies. There's about 5,000 people going, 87% underrepresented minority, 77% on Pell. The net price is actually not too bad considering what it could be at other places, but it's got a really high cohort default rate. If that CDR hits 30%, they actually get sanctioned by the feds. And depending on how the college rating system is designed, they might be in big trouble because they've got such a low CDR or high CDR. And so as an implication, feds are talking about tying federal student aid, right, Pell Grant money, to colleges according to their ratings. It's spiral, yeah, absolutely. And so what are these students going to do? They're going to go to cosmetology, right? I mean, if they're place bound, what are they going to do? What are they going to do? And so that's the question. And that's what I'm wrestling with. That's what I want to try to carve out, not just finding the problems, because I think we can spend all day on the problems, but also being creative about some solutions. And so some of the implications here. First of all, I think this is kind of maybe a rhetorical strategy here. If you think that all students are mobile or that distance education is going to solve all these problems, then we shouldn't really worry about this stuff, right? Those are good enough alternatives. That's actually kind of a common response, a disturbingly common response. I think a more plausible way to think about this is that efforts to improve consumer information are probably going to only help those who are mobile. Those are probably your wealthier, wider people, people prospecting for colleges. That's not really commonly acknowledged in our college choice discussion. It's not commonly acknowledged in our policy solutions on how to help improve access. And so what Ruth Lopez-Turley, who was previously in the sociology department here, now at Rice, she is looking at this stuff, and she's saying we've got to take place back. We've got to bring that back into the discussion. Don't treat college choice as though it's independent of place, and that we've got to really be clear on how these different policy proposals are going to fix and reverse those kind of structural inequalities we've just discussed. That's a tall order. They don't do it. They don't do it. And I don't hear a lot of discussion about the fundamental root problems here, right? And neither, I'm sure you all are probably nodding your heads with this one. So some ideas here, and this is the last slide. Some things I'm really interested in, and like I mentioned earlier, talking with Edward about this, even within a commuting zone, because you're from San Antonio, even within a commuting zone, there could be pockets of education deserts there. San Antonio is a case study. There's a great study on the development of University of Texas at San Antonio. This map, picture says 1,000 words. This map shows you where UTSA was built in the 70s because there was no college in the community. And Edward was saying it's the largest or the oldest city, one of the oldest cities in the US, and didn't have a public four-year school until 1970. And when they did open up that school, this little star right here, this is the white side of town, right? And this is the Hispanic part of town. They knew where the growth was. They knew where the needs were, and yet now people who live within San Antonio have access problems, have access challenges, have fundamental inequalities, just getting back and forth to the school. And so even within a community, we start to narrow down. It's striking of how much structural inequality there is. So how do these education deserts reflect the legacy of racial and economic segregation, places left unfinished at the time of creation? These are by design, broken. Alabama, talk about Rorschach tests. When I was presenting this at the Civil Rights Project, president of Dillard University, he's a political scientist. He said when he looked at the map, I'll back it up, when he looked at the education deserts map, he said he was struck. He saw the black belt right through here. He saw the black belt. And I said, I don't even know what that is. Honestly, I didn't know what it was. And I should know what that is. It is here, the black belt is a series of counties that cut across Alabama where there were fundamental and structural racial segregation and inequalities, but also the people who designed the systems, the educational systems there, by design, did not design them to be public. And so you see the legacy of that. It's not perfect one-to-one correlation, but you see the legacy of decisions that were made long ago on the structures of our communities and our built environments that have implications today. Hard to reverse. It could be a futile effort, it could be a paralyzing effort, but it shouldn't be. We've got to think of ways, new ways to not just identify these problems, but also find ways to potentially reverse them. And so what I wonder is, in the Farm Bill, anybody familiar with the Department of Agriculture, Farm Bill, you've got a classification for food deserts. So they know which communities have a food desert, and then those food deserts are eligible to receive additional federal support. Here's where it ties in with finance. It's coming roundabout here. But what if in HEA we had education deserts? Or what if there's another way to designate the communities that have the fewest public options in ways that we can actually build them up, try to avoid the parasitic institutions, or how to improve the colleges that are serving the students that are totally underserved in other places. And so that is, I think, a tall order, but this is the sort of, I hope I walked you all through sort of the evolution of this topic and where I'm left, and hopefully we can share ideas about how to collaborate, how to build off of this, or help me think through this. So with that, I think we've got, a good half hour? Thanks. Yeah, no.
Couple things. One, and maybe you can correct me, but when Wisconsin was involved as a state, ultimately when the university was created and the teachers' colleges were created, this particular university then started creating what they call then extension centers, or centers, which are today even colleges. And the philosophy wasn't written in the statutes, but looking at the Board of Regents minutes, was try to have a campus within 40 I can't remember, it was 40 miles or 40 minutes of driving from every household in the state. So what, again, it wasn't in the state statute. So that's just a historical piece.
That's helpful, yeah.
The second thing is, I noticed you can focus on 2-year publics, 4-year publics, or et cetera. But looking in the Midwest in particular, and you've got the two systems of higher ed, right? So you've got the technical college system, and when you observe that on a map, for example, MATC, which serves 8 counties, you've got the Truex campus in Dane County, but then you have MATC, Fort Atkinson, MATC, Reedsburg, Portage, et cetera, and then also Park Street.
Yeah.
But what's interesting is, and the challenge is enrollment. So they have to make a decision whether or not we create degree programs or courses based on enrollment. And they usually test a market, you know, based on there's no one there, right? Before the for-profits come cheap and high cost. But then they crunch the numbers and they make a decision like MATC decided to sell Park. So should we keep the South Campus, the Park Street, which is, you know, high African-American Latino population? And they look at the numbers and say, you know, can we afford this?
Right. Yeah.
The last thing, and I talked to you earlier about this, and what is flowing, and you and I exchanged email about this, is towns, villages, and counties, predominantly in rural areas across the United States, are taking this on their own. And they are creating what they're called communiversities. And it's finally making its way in the research, where they're saying they gave up. They tried going through the different higher ed systems and say, we really need a place here to educate. We have low educational attainment. Maybe our manufacturing places are now becoming more automated, so we need higher education. We need some educational attainment. And they don't get a response. So what they are doing is they're building existing buildings, or they build a new one, and they put an RFP to public colleges and universities in the state surrounding, not the state. And then universities respond, and they also do a market analysis in that region. They just say, we need a bachelor's degree or a one-year certificate or vocational or professional master's in these disciplines, because that's what serves this region.
Yeah.
And so they're doing it on their own. It's part of now economic development, social human capital development, but it's because the systems of higher ed or the individual campuses aren't willing to say, we'll establish a branch campus in this area.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the solutions to these problems are vast, right? And the way that I was sort of approaching this work is with really low expectations. I said, instead of trying to build new institutions, which I think is a very viable, it's very, I think, good solution in a lot of regards, how about we just identify the colleges that are going to be hurt the most by these, you know, policy ideas and give them a waiver, or like somehow like hold them harmless. So my expectations were pretty low on sort of the policy implications of this, but I think they run a wide range. They can be that, or to like what Noel's describing. Yeah, gosh.
And have you tried to compare the number of college degrees by the different ethnic groups to the distance? Try a correlation there, or some other measure how well that matches up.
Yeah, no, I didn't. So it's possible that there's a community that's a very large Hispanic community, but all the students who are enrolled in college are all white. It's very possible, but I'm not looking at that. And could you introduce yourself too?
Oh, Bob Rushline.
Bob, okay, thanks. Yeah, Jay. Yeah, Jay.
Looks like there's quite a correlation between economic development in the region and lack of, but it might be really useful to spell that out a little more. You know, what's about these places, what's going on economically in those areas, and I imagine like what Noel was saying some communities become aware that there's something missing, and then they start efforts to create it. But I think that, in terms of Washington kind of politics, that could really be interesting.
Speak to a lot of people. Yeah, I agree.
And to build on that real quick, I'm sorry, is what they're doing is they're using the financing mechanism of the tax increment financing that's state derived in every community has the ability to create a tax increment finance district so that they're off property taxes, and they usually have some form of local economic development property tax increases, and that pays off the bonds. So it's not necessarily higher education or the Higher Ed Act finance yet, but I love your idea. So they're kind of mixing the different revenue sources. And if you could get, I love this, if you could get the Higher Ed Act somehow, some pieces there, that'd be great.
Man.
Just to follow those questions, so the
Thanks.
regression table, so did you control for those kind of data?
Yeah, could you introduce yourself also, please?
Sun, Alpha?
Thanks. Yeah, I controlled for those labor market, labor market size, sort of the income levels, poverty rates, a number of manufacturing, percent of the jobs that are in manufacturing, a number of these variables here. No, I mean they're hit and miss. They're hit and miss. These racial and ethnic ones were just so we were so clear of patterns there. Yeah, and I'd be happy to share those full results too. Yeah.
So I think you touched on this, so I'm just talking to make sure I understand correctly, but and the implications and capacity is part of that. But using kind of the broad stroke data you have with institution to availability tells us a pretty stark story, or and it could even be intensified if we look at program availability and drill down institutionally, right? Because, for example, your example in Texas, where that one community or junior college is the one place to go for transferable degree or a range of options, they may or may not have the slots available for students to even enroll, right? So the fact that that building institution exists doesn't mean that the students have the chance to enroll there. And so the implications are maybe there's pieces that we could get policymakers to make change and at least build capacity within those institutions as precious institutions, not ones that should be torn apart before we move on to the next.
Yeah, Taylor helped me with, sorry for, calling you out here. Taylor helped me dig into these education deserts after they were defined, and you went in and did Google searches on, whether they're satellite campuses or these extension campuses, and because those don't show up in iPads, and for the most part, I mean, they offered like criminal justice degrees, education degrees, and maybe business degrees, like across the country. So I think that kind of ties in with what Jason's getting at.
There's an interesting group that you might want to integrate into your analysis. That's the military veterans and also active duty military individuals. These parasitical institutions that I was talking about, which we could also call blood-sucking, or opportunistic, often cluster around the military bases and try to draw in military families and of course the military individuals themselves, and of course veterans often have a small pool of money that they can begin to utilize for educational expenses, and they have been exploited very heavily. But just the notion of what's available to people in some type of driving distance, and one of the reasons why I'm specifying this group as well, there may be some Veterans Administration monies or whatever interest in your data.
Interesting.
Exploring that.
Thanks. That's an interesting point. Yeah.
Yeah, this is great work, and I think as you said at the beginning, it bears a lot more probing and looking into, and has all sorts of potential implications, many of which I think people just aren't thinking about now, need to be, and then I think the question always becomes, well, we pointed out the problem, and how do we begin to think about solutions? So a couple of thoughts and people can react. So in my experience, an awful lot of private colleges, the vast majority of which are not selective, are very entrepreneurial these days because they need enrollment and they need the revenue that comes from it. A lot of our public campuses, especially the comprehensives, are very entrepreneurial. They need enrollment too. We're in an environment where high school number of graduates is going down in Wisconsin. So they're looking for places to put down a branch where they will have students. So it's not that they're resisting going where there are students. They may resist going where they don't think there are students who will come. So part of the question then becomes, in these deserts, how do we convince the colleges that there are students there who will come? How do we get the students to want to come?
Right.
I think one way to think about that, that's had some success, is working with local business and industry who can say, well, we'll be a partner with you. We need a workforce in X. And X is going to be something that's specific to that particular industry. It's not going to be English majors like me out here. But that's okay if that provides a magnet into the higher ed system for people who otherwise wouldn't have an opportunity to get into it. So I think that partnership between the community, the higher ed institution, and local business and industry is one way to think about this. Now, you can also find, of course, in some of these deserts, there is no local business and industry, and that's not
Sure.
But in some cases, I can give you some examples of that, actually.
Excellent.
And then this is an interesting other way of thinking about it. So they didn't use these terms then, but so when I was president, I was approached by the county executive in Waukesha County, one of the two wealthiest counties in the state, who said that they wanted to have a baccalaureate degree granting institution in Waukesha County because, in effect, they were in an education desert. They had no baccalaureate public, they're private, but no public baccalaureate degree granting institution in Waukesha County. And people would not drive into Milwaukee after a day of work to do this. That was the argument. And, our two-year campuses are funded, some of you may know, with the physical plan by the county. County tax dollars support the physical plan, the state provides the programs. And of course, once you get a baccalaureate degree, then you can claim you're no longer a county entity and you don't have to pay. The state pays for the physical plan.
Interesting.
So this was partly an effort to get out from under the county is paying to support UW-Waukesha, but also was an argument in effect that this was a different kind of education desert. And so, I mean, that's an interesting thing. It's not always mileage. When the City University of New York decided we're not going to do any more remedial education at our four-year campuses, everybody who needs remediation is going to have to go for a two-year campus in the city system where there are 16 institutions. Some students said, well, this is going to take me now, instead of a half hour on the subway, an hour and 45 minutes to get to the closest community college, and I can't do it. So there are all sorts of interesting things to be lifted up here and looked under.
It's going to show that this definition of deserts is pretty blunt and arbitrary at this point. There's a typology, I think, is what I'm hearing there. That's helpful. Thank you.
Just a thought, I was just thinking about access to education in terms of, it's reminded me of colonization, because the idea is that education is viewed as, it's an access is a commodity, right? So then it has to go where people are, and it has to be where there's economic development and such. Now, what's it, and how, when we want to go and convert people, right? And that's the difference. Now, because that's not a commodity, that's sort of like, to get people to convert and to get people to buy into something. People would go to where there is nothing, and where people are not liberal, accordingly, and convert them. So if we were to think of education access as access to church, it would be better.
That's good.
I just thought about it in terms of, where do, back in the colonization period, and where, to which extent, right, that the people in power would go across the world to convert people.
I think,
to which extent we are not willing to go across the county to provide education access.
Interesting.
In Wisconsin, the rural counties are churches and bars.
And I know a lot of people know you in the room, but could you introduce yourself too, please? Could you introduce yourself too, please, just for the group?
I'm Dan.
Thanks. I love it. Yes.
I have a question for your Hispanic coefficients, could you really just be picking up like settlement patterns or maybe a change? I know in some of these places you have, I don't know, in North Carolina or something like 400% change in population in one decade alone, and you're doing 2002 to 2012. So really, you're maybe what you're picking up is just resettlement patterns.
Yeah.
And maybe a better analysis would be maybe a rate of change or control for rate of change, and or maybe separate states by new destination immigrant receiving states and old destination immigrant states.
That's good. Yep. Thanks.
And you're adjusting for, these are only folks that are college age, right?
These are, 25 plus. Sorry, I didn't make that clear. These, for the population, is 25 plus, but I could change that. Yeah. Yeah. So I think you would see these pretty darn similar patterns, but maybe even stronger patterns.
And also only full-time students?
Well, the population data is just the total number of people, of adults in the commuting zone that are older than 25. So, I'm sorry?
Might be different parents, not many
Yeah. Yeah. I could break it out by age, but I think...
I guess what for me is a clear connection between, I think, sort of segregation and what you're saying here. And I guess for me is like is this just another measure of, is that what you're saying this is some kind of like index of dissimilarity or some kind of segregation measure?
It could be. I've tried to bring some of that in to sort of account for the degree of segregation that already exists in some of these commuting zones, try to pick up some of that sort of structural, sort of historical piece. But I was using Massey's stuff from 2000, so I'm not sure how, if anybody's familiar with that or can get a good source, let me know, because I think that you're onto something there.
Because you also, so you have multiple counties within community zones, and you're clustering on those zones?
Yeah, on the zones.
On zones.
Yep, on the zones. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, at first I was thinking I could just break this out by county, but then I realized, that doesn't quite capture community, because you could be in a county that actually is really, proximate to a college, but that college is in a different county, and so you sort of lose, it's like a political boundary rather than an economic boundary. So I think there's a lot of sort of fine-tuning that could happen with defining those communities and how to really capture what's going on there. That's why initially it was just 1 year. I just used 2012 for my analysis, and that was the first response I got, was you're not picking up on the migration patterns. And so I went back to 2002. But I could probably go back even further, or even take it by decade or something like that. I think you're onto something for sure. Yeah. This is helpful, guys. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, Bob Rushline again. Just the census tract.
Yeah. Yeah.
How many people have been there 5 years or more?
Okay.
Given census tract or county, or something could be a measure of how diverse it is. I mean, Eugene, Oregon, or Madison, Wisconsin.
Okay.
Eugene is very pluralistic. There's people from all 50 states just pouring in and out. There's about half in a 5-year period. You might have half and half.
Yeah.
Whereas it might be more settled in Madison and so forth.
Absolutely.
In the Midwest, it's not as mobile.
Yeah. Yeah.
Society as the coastal areas.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's, I think, where this line of research is going and ought to go, is sort of these case studies, or really get at the local experience. And I forget the woman's name, but she just got the Ash Dissertation of the Year award, where she did that. She looked at education deserts in what town? I forget what town, but she rode the public transit. She lived in the community to see what the sort of flow, was like. I'm sorry? Yes, thanks. At University of Missouri now, professor there. But I guess what I'm hearing you say is that census tract, local context is really where we're going to see this stuff. Maybe even to Edward's point. And this is sort of a little blunt, a little too big, but
it'd be fun
something.
to have a definition for us in Wisconsin of what we consider
Yeah.
an education desert,
Yeah.
and to the degree with which, in terms of policy, we can then drive change around that.
You know, yeah. And my sense is that, you know, I was starting to think of this as sort of a way to sort of counter the discussion on performance funding. What if we, instead of like having our funding models be, you know, enrollment funding or performance funding as sort of the two alternatives that we discuss, thinking about, well, how does this maybe fit in with a funding model? And at first I was thinking maybe we could draw on equity funding or adequacy funding from K through 12, but I'm not sure if that really fits well. But maybe just having a designation and having that designation, you know, provide you a opportunity for different funds is the way I'm starting to think that maybe this fits in with finance. I don't know. Yeah.
Sarah Hallis with the Information and Technology Academy of the College Program here on campus. I'm curious, I think I heard you touch on this a little bit, and maybe it was on a context slide, I'm not sure. Did you say you did some research around proximity as it relates to completion?
Not as it relates to completion, but as it relates to application. Okay. So applying to a school and then enrolling in a school. Yeah. But I bet there's got to be something out there on completions.
Yeah, I mean, particularly because you talked about the geography of opportunity literature related to community ties and spillover effects, distance elasticity. And this is, you're looking more the access rather than the completion end, but I think it's also important to, it's probably beyond the scope of what you're trying to do here, but it would be interesting to look at geography as it relates to the completion.
Absolutely, absolutely.
It matters in terms of, you know, I'm just thinking about like, you know, what you're finding, you know, for example, American Indian students aren't necessarily, you know, there's more open access alternatives, but if we look at, you know, one of the new initiatives we're doing where I work is related to creating more of a pipeline for Native students to come to UW-Madison through the Tribal Technology Institute. Because at Madison, the percentage of students who are Native who stay and complete is
low.
abysmal.
Yeah.
So that's an interesting piece of it.
Good. Yeah, and to my knowledge, and folks who are more familiar with student persistence, I'd be curious of what you all know, but to my knowledge, distance doesn't play a big part in that current discussion, in the current literature, does it?
I don't know.
I don't think it does, yeah.
I'm not 100% sure.
Yeah.
It's been a while since
Man. Yeah, Rochelle.
So this is not totally a group thought, and so we can talk about it later too. First, I want to say I love what you're doing.
Oh, thanks.
So I'm just going to say that publicly because it could totally revolutionize how we think about college choice. I just love it. But I was thinking related to funding. It seems to me like so again, this isn't totally, I haven't totally teased this out, but it seems like there might be an interesting connection between Gary Orfield's work on segregation and desegregation, and then there's school funding attached to that too, in the K-12 system, and these education deserts. And I would be really curious to almost like put a map of like from Orfield's work of the school segregation and desegregation up to your education desert and see how they look together.
Interesting, yeah.
Because I bet that there's a correlation between the two, and I bet it also would relate to finance.
Good.
I bet there's also funding issues there.
Good. He started going in this route too at one point in his career too. So I think that there's a lot of excellent ties to make. Yeah. Thanks, Rochelle. Yeah. Oh, can you introduce yourself too, Sarah?
Oh, I'm Rochelle. Nick's colleague and a big fan of Nick's work.
Oh, thanks. Well, likewise. Yeah. Gosh, please contact me, reach out anytime. I'm happy to continue this conversation, but I guess we probably should.
Any other questions or comments for Nick or input? One of the things that I thought would be cool is it would sure be nice to add, if you're interested or anyone else is interested, student voice in terms of testimonial on how place matters in higher education. And if you know of students who would like to, for example, pen a WISCAPE blog entry on something like place matters to me.
Our geography students would be all over.
that may be
Cool.
something that we could talk about. It would be kind of cool to add to. But
Did you write your name down?
next Tuesday, webcast for Doug Harris, and then if you're interested on the continuing conversation about affordability and regional comprehensives. But thanks so much, Nick.
Oh,
and
thank you. Thank you, guys. Yeah.
Thanks everybody for coming, and if there's any cookies left, make sure you grab them.
Yeah.